July 1st, 2006, Gelsenkirchen. A World Cup quarter-final between two teams that genuinely couldn't stand each other. 90 scoreless minutes deep into a match that felt like it was building towards something ugly. It got there in the 60th minute, and the ugly thing wasn't even the sending off. It was what happened right after. Wayne Rooney, 20, gets tangled up with Ricardo Carvalho near the box. His boot lands somewhere it shouldn't. Maybe on purpose, maybe not. Doesn't really matter once the referee's hand goes into his pocket. Red card. England down to 10 men for the last half hour of a World Cup quarter-final, which is about as bad a moment as international football produces. That should have been the headline. A 20-year-old sent off in the biggest game of his career. Instead, as Rooney trudges toward the tunnel, the broadcast catches something else. Cristiano Ronaldo, his own club teammate, turning toward the Portuguese bench and winking. Less than a second of footage. No slow-motion breakdown built into the live feed. Nobody shoving a microphone in his face to ask what it meant. Just a young man's face turning, one eye closing, right as his Manchester United colleague walked off in disgrace. England fans didn't need it explained. To them, it read as confession. Ronaldo had gotten his own teammate sent off, and now he was celebrating it. Pundits were rewinding the tape within minutes. By the next morning, it had a name that would follow him for years. The wink, Portugal survived. Penalties, England missed 3 of 4, out of the World Cup. And the story that dominated every back page in the country wasn't the exit, it was the wink. Here's what's actually on the record. The backlash was fast and it was brutal, and it landed on 21-year-old almost exclusively. English papers ran with the idea that Ronaldo had engineered the whole thing. Phone-in radio lit up. Columnists openly speculated about whether he could ever set foot back in a United dressing room, given that he'd apparently just betrayed a teammate on live television in front of the entire country. For a few weeks that summer, the idea that he'd have to leave Old Trafford wasn't treated as a rumor. It was treated as settled. What strikes me most, writing about this 2 decades later, isn't that it happened. It's how fast it happened. Half a second of ambiguous footage, and within hours a 21-year-old had a fully formed motive attached to his name. A headline, a villain arc, all before he'd said a single word about what that gesture actually meant. Nobody paused to ask whether a wink might mean relief. Frustration. Nothing at all. A nervous caught by a camera at the worst possible instant. Ronaldo mostly stayed quiet about it in the immediate aftermath. Rooney, years later, said plainly that he never blamed him, and the two carried on as teammates the following season without incident, but by then it didn't matter. The wink had already done its job. It had been replayed so many times, it stopped being a moment that needed interpreting and became shorthand for a personality the country had already decided it understood. That's really where this story starts, not with what Ronaldo did, with what everyone else decided it meant. If you want to understand what happened to Ronaldo that summer, forget the wink for a second and look at the mechanism underneath it. Because this is one of the oldest tricks group psychology plays on itself, and football fandom runs it almost on autopilot every time a national team crashes out. When a country pours years of hope into a tournament and gets nothing back, the fans don't just need to grieve. They need an explanation, and "we simply lost" is a miserable one to sit with. "Someone did this to us" is much easier to carry. Psychologists studying fan behavior call this externalization, a kind of moral licensing where collective pain gets pointed at a single face because blaming one person is so much lighter than accepting that the team just wasn't good enough on the day. Ronaldo checked every box for the role. Foreign. Playing for the team that just knocked England out. Young, cocky in a way some corners of English football culture never forgave. Already tagged as a show-off for his stepovers. And he happened to be standing in exactly the wrong spot, doing exactly the wrong thing at the exact moment. 11 million furious fans needed somewhere to point. This is how villain narratives actually get built. and it's not through careful judgment. Researchers call it rapid moral coding. Under emotional stress, the brain doesn't want nuance, it wants resolution, and it grabs the simplest available story and commits to it hard and fast. Nobody stopped to consider alternate explanations. There wasn't time, and honestly, there wasn't appetite. Tabloids didn't invent that hunger. They just fed it. Because a headline about betrayal sells a lot more papers than a headline about missed penalties. A villain generates far more angry callers than a clean result does. The economics of the press and the emotional needs of a wounded fan base were pointing in exactly the same direction. And once they lined up, the story hardened almost overnight. Within days, the wink wasn't ambiguous footage anymore. It was proof of character. What's worth sitting with is what that actually does to a 21-year-old. Sports psychologists who study this kind of scapegoating point to something specific: the total loss of narrative control. A player having a bad game can fix it over time by playing well. A player turned into a villain off one gesture is dealing with something else entirely, an identity built by other people, repeated until it calcifies, that he never got a chance to shape before it was already locked in. I want to be careful here because I have no idea what Ronaldo actually felt those first few weeks, and by most accounts, he didn't say much publicly. What is documented is the environment waiting for him back home. A dressing room the press had already decided he'd poisoned. Teammates whose loyalty to him was being questioned in print. And a summer where his future at the club was treated as a live question rather than a formality. And the pattern researchers keep finding in athletes who make it through this is almost never that they explain their way out. They outperform the story until the story gets too small to matter. That takes years. First, it takes surviving the part where a country has already decided who you are, based on nothing more than half a second and its own need to blame somebody. While the back pages were busy deciding who Ronaldo was, one man in Manchester did the thing almost nobody else in English football seemed willing to do. Ferguson called him, "This bit isn't speculation. It's in the interviews, the biographies, Ferguson's own comments over the years since." Within days of the elimination, with the press openly questioning whether Ronaldo could stay at United at all, Ferguson reached out directly and told him his place at the club wasn't in question. He later called the reaction to the wink wildly out of proportion to whatever had actually happened on the pitch, a manager flatly refusing to play along with a story his own country's press had already written. That decision mattered more than it might look on paper. Sports psychologists studying resilience in young athletes point to one factor that tends to decide whether a public scapegoating turns into a lasting wound or just a bad summer. Whether the environment around the athlete absorbs the pressure or piles on. An athlete facing hostile headlines while his own manager and teammates are also side-eyeing him tends to spiral. One who comes home to a club that shields him has a real advantage. United gave Ronaldo that shield. Ferguson backed him publicly and kept backing him. The dressing room didn't fracture the way the papers had confidently predicted. And Rooney himself has said more than once that he never held it against him, that they carried on fine as teammates. Then it stopped being about a wink at all and started being about numbers .200607. 23 goals in all competitions, PFA Players Player of the Year, voted by the players he shared a pitch with, not the papers that spent the summer trying to run him out of the country. 2007-08, 42 goals, the Golden Boot, PFA Player of the Year again, FWA Footballer of the Year, his first Ballon d'Or. United won the league both seasons and the Champions League in 2008. The villain story didn't just fade quietly. It got buried under a pile of results so large that keeping the original narrative alive meant ignoring an ever-growing stack of evidence pointing the other way. This is the pattern that shows up again and again in athletes who survive this kind of public trial by ambiguous footage. Nobody talks their way out of it. Ronaldo didn't need to convince English football the wink meant something innocent. He just had to keep scoring until the results made more noise than the headline ever had. None of this makes the summer of 2006 disappear. The hostility was real. The transfer talk was real. A 21-year-old genuinely spent months as one of the most hated men in English football over half a second of ambiguous body language. But what the record actually shows, if you're honest about it, is a little uglier than the wink itself. How fast a wounded country will manufacture someone to blame, and how many years of undeniable proof it takes before that country quietly, without ever really admitting it, takes the verdict back.